Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. The topic for today is measuring impact, API analytics for product managers. A really, really pertinent topic. And we have a star-studded set of panelists and guests today who are joining us. I am Budha, product evangelist at Tyke and host of the All About APIs podcast. And I'm going to be here, hosting and facilitating today's conversation, taking up your audience questions, as well as some of the questions that we deemed worthy of discussion as of today's session. So without further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. We've got Deepa Goyal to begin with. Hey, Deepa, hello and welcome for today's session.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. I am Deepa Goyal. I am product strategy lead at Postman. I have been working on APIs for a number of years now across Twilio, PayPal, and now at Postman. It's something that I'm very passionate about, API product management and how we can build API businesses successfully. I love to share this with people. So one of the recent things is I wrote a book called API Analytics for Product Managers that is now out, available on Amazon, that you can easily find. And it is also the topic of today's discussion. So very excited to be here.
Wonderful. Really, really glad to have you here with us. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, so I'm the user research lead here at Tyke. I've been here just over 2 years now, so fairly new to the world of APIs, but I come from product research and user research been doing user research for 10 plus years now. Across a bunch of domains, here to hopefully ask some pertinent questions to Deepa and the audience to hear all about the trials and tribulations of API product management.
Thank you so much for joining us. So again, the idea behind today's conversation is really looking at the world of APIs, API products, as well as the perspectives of obviously someone who has been a product manager, some of the challenges, some of the things that matter, some of the things that you value when you're thinking about product strategy, as well as taking a more user experience, user research approach to things as well, things that you do need to consider when you're building out that API product strategy. And we'll hear a little bit more about it. So with that, today's topic. In today's web ecosystem, APIs have become essential to web technologies, allowing different systems and applications to communicate and share data and functionality. It's a world where APIs are now quite ubiquitous. I think it's safe to say that, but it's gone a step further. So as organizations build APIs and API-first products, which we'll hear about a little bit more in just a few moments, it is essential for product managers specifically to measure the effectiveness by identifying the right KPIs and building a robust product strategy. So there are 5 key questions that we're going to be exploring today, and we'll be looking at it from the perspective of product strategy. We'll be looking at it from the perspective of UX research, and we'll be looking at it as well holistically in terms of how it fits into the overall product strategy when you're building one. What are the KPIs that matter? So 5 key questions. I think I'm going to list them out right at the beginning so that you at least have some initial idea about what we are going to be looking into, and then we'll go into these questions directly. So 5 key questions that we're going to be discussing today when we are going to be looking at the shift towards APIs as a fully qualified product. Basically, what does APIs as product actually mean? What are the different areas and elements of it? We'll also be looking at some of the biggest challenges facing product managers who are new to APIs today. Then we'll look at the critical metrics that matter, what to measure when you're measuring API impact, specifically around infrastructure, product, and businesses. We'll then go into using KPIs to build a product strategy, which leads nicely into some of the best practices for optimizing API performance and profitability. So 5 key questions, and I think the way we'll be taking these on is we'll have a discussion amongst the three of us to begin with, and then the floor is going to be open to anyone who has thoughts and opinions around this. Once again, we'll give you space to unmute yourself or ask those questions, and we'll pick questions as we go along. On to the first question then. So let's explore sort of the initial beginnings of today's discussion, sort of the foundation of today's topic. And again, I think Deepa mentioned about the book that she's written. This is the book which I'm not sure it's going to be visible. Maybe it is visible. It's all about, again, API analytics for product management. And the key theme and key element of what gets things going there is this notion of APIs as a product. So maybe, Deepa, you could kick things off and tell us a little bit more about what that entails. What are the different elements, components, and things to consider?
Absolutely. So I think taking it from the top, I think when we think about products, originally before internet, it was like physical products. And then now we have software products that people are familiar with in terms of like web products, web experiences. And now I think we're coming into a phase of technology where you have things like APIs that are beginning to be considered products. And when we say a product, it's something that's generating revenue, where you're trying to reach an audience. You have a target customer that you're trying to reach, and ultimately you're applying product thinking and product sense to building this product in API format, where people could be doing many different things with your APIs, and you're trying to work through what does that mean for your APIs in terms of how you design it, how do you design the user experience on top of it, and ultimately how you measure success. So I think that application of product thinking and product sense that is now being talked about for APIs is the API as a product transition that we're seeing in the industry.
Great. And so what would you say, Deepa, have been some of the biggest like technical or organizational barriers that maybe people in the audience might have to overcome when it comes to going from, I guess, more technically focused and I guess internal APIs to more public-facing consumable APIs?
Absolutely. APIs have for the longest time been a part of infrastructure. Engineers are very close to it. They understand the value, but most of the APIs that are built in any organization are actually internal. So there is definitely a bigger proportion of people working on internal APIs, and oftentimes there isn't a product manager in a lot of organizations, since it's still a new concept of treating APIs as products and thinking about the pain points there. So I think the biggest hurdle there is also pioneering the idea of API as a product within the company and being able to partner with engineering teams to understand their pain points, because it's not just the external facing APIs that have customer pain points, because if you think about it, there is the internal developer that is using internal APIs, and some of the challenges there can be that in large organizations, a lot of times you have APIs that are that nobody's using. It was built and it was like somehow not being used anymore, which is a security risk. Sometimes you have multiple teams, if they're working on the same set of APIs, that's a lot of duplication, and you're probably not creating a complete product. So things like that really contribute to developer productivity internally. And I think together, when you build APIs more strategically, internally or externally, you can have much more finished products and be more successful at it.
Yeah, more and more, we've been seeing the job title of API product manager pop up, right? We recently ran a round of research interviews where we spoke to members of an API product team at a fintech, and essentially they are the sort of champions of API as products. They work with and almost consult with wider teams across the whole organization to own API management, to look at driving standards such as documentation and API product design. Yeah, it feels like there's definitely a wider trend out there to like actually call yourself an API product manager as the way to promote that way of that product thinking, as you alluded to, right?
Absolutely. I think there's also some companies like Twilio and Stripe, and them being so successful, especially Stripe in the payment space, I think has really done a lot for raising that awareness that APIs need to be treated as products. And when you first think about a product, when a product is conceived or a business is conceived, instead of first putting together a website, you're thinking about starting from APIs. I think that's really the switch between, like, where do you start, or do you think of your APIs on top of your web experience, or do you think of them independently? So as everybody is becoming more and more aware of these success stories of the Twilios and Stripes out there, they are a lot of leaders are investing more in hiring for these roles, and people are able to get into the space, which is very exciting, I think. And there's a lot of opportunity since it's a fairly new role. I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to come in and do great things.
Yeah, and there's some great examples you mentioned of that API fast mentality as well, right? Sort of thinking as, regardless of your products, that the fast touch point that you might open up to your consumers potentially is the API. So ultimately, in that scenario, the whole API design is based around the wider product, right?
Yeah, actually, you brought up API design, and I think that's a very good segue into thinking about when we talk about product management, we have to apply outside in thinking. Think of your customer first, and the key difference between being API first and not is a lot of times when we have some other experience and you're just building some APIs on top of it, or you're not thinking about customers, then you tend to design APIs very differently compared to when you actually put emphasis on user research, user experience, and design APIs for a better user experience. And in case of APIs, your customers are developers, and it's a different persona, which is not commonly talked about, not a lot of people are very aware of, and there's a lot of research techniques to work with that persona. So I think that's really the key difference of, like, combining that customer centricity and bringing that to API design is really key in building great APIs.
I think while this is a new area of development, I think there's also definite commonalities. I think the starting point, like you say, might have shifted from, are we looking website thinking, or we're going API thinking? But I think ultimately, I think there's still that higher level where there are the common areas. There is still, okay, we've got an objective to meet, but that objective, in order to solve or address that objective, you're not thinking a website, you're not thinking other tools, but you're going that API first in that approach. And you gave a really good example there with Stripe being one of the, the leaders in the space a little bit, where, from a user experience perspective, developer experience perspective, from API having that API first approach, they've done a really, really good job. I'm wondering if there are any other sort of industry examples that we might also bring up here. And I think, to me, Okta potentially comes up as well, as, specifically around the identity provider space, can very, very important space to be in. And the way they've approached that and made the overall journey being a lot more simplistic and simplified, even though it's a very important, essential component. But just because something is important, essential, and powerful doesn't need to be complicated. So at least from my perspective, that's been a really good approach that I've seen with Okta. But I'm curious about, any further examples that might clarify in people's mind what, an API product or APIs product looks like in the wild.
Absolutely. I think Okta is a great example because people don't realize that it's really APIs talking to each other in the background, when that's simplifying this experience. And when enterprises, are paying Okta and getting that product, and Okta is doing a great job of, like, allowing people to integrate really easily. I think in recent times, OpenAI APIs really stand out, because if you think about it, ChatGPT was only launched 30th November last year. So it's been a few months, maybe half a year. And as soon as they launched their APIs, you see this, so many applications have been built on top of it. And I think it's really interesting to see from the perspective of how successful APIs can be and how they can unlock innovation. The other thing is also they did a great job of making really easy APIs that allowed so many developers to really quickly, without much handholding, be able to start with their APIs and go forward. I think Notion APIs are also really fairly new and really effective. It has a big user base, and I think all the integrations and things that people are building on top of it is great. So there's, when we think about APIs, there is the something like payments. When you think of Stripe or PayPal, is very like when you think about the transaction, the business is like the payment happening, or financial transaction happening. But in when we think about Twilio, which could be like an SMS or a voice call, that's per SMS is the business transaction. And I think those are some of the things that vary in like how these different APIs have different business value. I think Google Maps API is a great example that essentially enabled Uber and Lyft, things like that, where this idea of like you can track your delivery person on your phone or your ride on your phone just became a norm, was really enabled by those mapping APIs.
Absolutely. I think it's just that thinking about how you make things easy when you're trying to accomplish something, and how do you, I think as tools and platforms develop, I think the challenge that they will face, I feel, is going to be getting out of people's way. Like, yes, get things done, but also just forget about it as much as possible so that you're not necessarily fighting against something or having to learn. Maybe interact with it, get your job done, and think about your next big idea or how to make this better. So maybe, and one of the ways is going to be that degree of abstraction that something like APIs would bring into that conversation. So that's really good. There's a question that we've got in here, which is from Samuel. Thank you so much for the question, Samuel. Is it important for me to get more involved in API design with engineering if my customers aren't developers or technical in nature?
So if your customers are not developers for your API?
So I think we've spoken a little bit in the first question here, where we spoke about who the end user of our APIs and API products are, and I think one of the key consumers of that tend to be developers. I would be curious about who your actual consumers are, like who is using your products. Maybe Samuel, you could do a bit of a follow up on that, or maybe even unmute yourself if you wish to have a discussion. That might be easier.
Hello, hi. So I work on a product that's so it's a B2B organization. Our customers customers aren't technical, but I think getting involved more in the API design as a PM is key, especially when it comes to like tracking and all. Yes, I can use third-party tracking stuff, but my question is, so just going back to my question, is it important if I'm involved more in the API design, given that my customers aren't necessarily like developers or like technical people? Does it make sense? And what would be the advantages to that, to me being involved more? Let me know if that's...
Wow, as the user researcher here, I would fully advocate for your involvement. If you're the one who has that understanding, or in fact, as a PM needs to elicit that understanding via talking to those end users or prospects, I think obviously it's always a trade-off between what engineering can deliver and what your consumers are asking for, but definitely would fall under your responsibility. I'd suggest to sort of be that bridge to reach out to your customers, understand, okay, well, what is it they're looking to achieve by consuming your services or product in API form? What loose area is it that your product offering is within, Samuel? So what are you looking to offer to consumers?
It's an FMCG organization, so it's an e-commerce fast-moving consumer goods. So we sell to, we connect businesses with suppliers. So that's the business.
Okay, and so you're looking to offer up APIs to suppliers to allow them to connect into some of your services directly. Is that the idea?
So currently, what we only offer is sort of like a storefront where these small businesses get to purchase from. So it's sort of like our business model is sort of like we have the middleman. So we buy from suppliers and then we sell to smaller businesses. That's the current model, but we can expand into more areas such that we can give these suppliers data in terms of what products are people more interested in and other stuff. So generally, I just write requirements and have discussions with engineering, but I'm trying to find out whether me being involved more in the API designs would be advantageous for us as a business. But yeah, that's sort of like in summary what the business is.
When we think about developers, I think taking a step back, irrespective of the business model, when we think about your customer for an API, it's not necessary that they're always going to be technical. So there is the low-code, no-code developer that may not be very technical and may not be even an engineer, and is just somebody trying to hack something together. And when we think about building an API experience, it's not just for the programmers. I think that the word developer is often in people's mind used interchangeably with programmers, but I think we have to really understand the developer is anybody who is trying to develop with develop any kind of application with your APIs. And that developer could be a very highly technical person, could have a team of 100 people, could be a very small organization, maybe a non-profit organization with like one person doing a lot of things. And I have been in that situation at Twilio. I was PM for their serverless tools, and our customers were all across the board. Some were really small and some were really large. And the idea is, from a design perspective, as a PM, even if you're not driving the very specifics of the API design itself, or the specifics of like what endpoints we should build, what you can drive is the end result. And that could be time to first call, time to value, time to first transaction. And to enable that, you could do many different things. So for example, there is the aspect of like give more copy paste code. If you one of the things I've done is just like really trying to understand through customer interviews and a lot of research, what are the major use cases for my product, and that the way and at Twilio, where we have so many different APIs and products, how are people stitching these things together and solving certain use cases? What are those major use cases, and trying to give some copy paste code for those use cases so people can get through it quickly. So we have to think about this low code, no code developer who and trying to enable them in any kind of tool. It could be a click-through experience, the way people just allow certain applications to add to your social media, or like Shopify does it really well in the particular similar model as you, Samuel, is Shopify allows APIs using which people can build applications on Shopify Marketplace, and the merchants on Shopify can just click through and integrate those applications into their Shopify Marketplace and get those services. There's also a complex payment model there. So they're really further along in how they've done it, but ultimately they have abstracted that API experience into a few click-through experiences for their low-code, no-code sellers on Shopify, and allowed them to get through it really quickly.
And then just to close on that, I'd suggest, somewhere to your point, do you need to get involved? And maybe you're asking, how would you get involved? What I would suggest is, as soon as your engineering team have got some loose notion of what the API could provide, reach out as soon as you possibly can to your potential consumers and do whatever you can to mock that up in a very lightweight, prototypey way, and present that as a rough concept of, okay, well, this is what you'd be able to query. These are the endpoints. Obviously, if it's a less technical audience, you'd want to mock that up in maybe a more visual or endy way. But definitely think about how you would illustrate packaging that all up to those potential consumers very early on, and see, okay, well, this is our concept of what not just the underlying API, but the actual developer or consumer experience, to Deepa's point, could look like, and then iterate from there. Understand, okay, well, is there additional work on the front end to enable that consumer to consume those APIs? Is the proposition of what you're opening up to be able to be accessed actually adding some potential value to those consumers, and testing both the underlying data model essentially, as well as the front end and the consumer experience as soon as you possibly can, would be my advice to that.
Something that a lot of companies do, I've seen Twilio do and PayPal do, is they have communities of developers that they engage with a little bit more, and the strategy of how they roll out their API products involves launching betas first, where you have a limited set of people that you can engage with more, and only allowing them and allowing APIs to evolve with their feedback. So you have a small set of customers that you can engage with, you can get their feedback, have your developer team engage with them, so that your APIs, you build certain confidence in your APIs and how usable they are, and then slow rollout. So I think releasing APIs to like larger and larger number of customers is how we also tackle that challenge. And ultimately, one of the biggest challenges of APIs as products is, once a customer has integrated with your APIs, it's not very easy to change your APIs, because if you change them, it will break their integration. And you're looking at customers' development cycle, trying to reach these customers, getting them to prioritize changes in their application because of how you made changes is very difficult. It's not just the time-consuming aspect, but it's just sometimes really difficult to get it prioritized and worked through, which is very, very bad for business. It could break their application, which could be a breaking change. No customer wants that. You lose a lot of customer trust. So being really methodical from a product standpoint in terms of how you develop your product in phases, get user feedback, and slowly make your product mature with your audience really helps. And I'm sure that your engineers would really appreciate going that route, so that in the future they also are set up to make changes to the APIs without breaking customer code.
Great. I think we've got a nice little discussion already. I think we've spent a fair amount of time, which is good, but we've also touched upon a few different points, which is great as well. So I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over, I think, the biggest challenges bit, because I think we've covered a lot of that already and some of the strategies around it. So I'm going to dive straight into sort of the main crux of what we are looking for here, which is around the metrics that matter. So as a business, when you're thinking about, whether you're thinking API design, whether you're thinking about product strategy, there are certain specific things that you do need to measure in terms of understanding the effectiveness of what you're building or developing. So Deepa, question for you to start things off. What are those key metrics to measure the API impacts? I know there are 3 of them, so perhaps take away. Tell us all about it.
Absolutely. So there is, when you think about APIs, and taking a step back, product manager's role, it may not be to actually develop the APIs, but I think working closely with their UX partners and making sure that customer experience is great, working closely with analytics, or establishing analytics yourself, or however it is in your organization. Product managers are the people driving that combination of user experience and metrics. And I think it's really, really important to think of those two together. And when we think about metrics, bringing them together. So in terms of APIs, I like to segment API metrics in terms of three different pillars. One being infrastructure, which is the essentially underlying aspect, the most technical ground reality of your API in terms of how it works, how scalable it is. This is infrastructure metrics such as uptime, reliability, errors per minute, or average and max latency and error code distributions, things that are measurable in terms of quantitative metrics you can set to measure that your API is usable and reliable for your end customer. The second pillar of metrics that I think is on top of this infrastructure is the product metrics, which is more aligned with the user experience. So let's assume that your infrastructure metrics is great. Your API is really effective, and there's no technical problems in it. Then the next thing is the experience you build on top of it, how people discover your APIs, how they engage with them, how they, what is the activation, what do you even identify, what event you identify as activation, and things like trying to measure the overall experience. And I think that's where a lot of metrics that you commonly hear about, things like time to first hello world or time to first API call, is you can also measure time to first transaction, because when you think about it, it's like you can integrate with PayPal, but then unless you make a payment using it, it's not truly a conversion. If you can integrate with Twilio, but unless you're actually sending SMSs, you're not really using the product. So the aspect of like making a few calls could be different from making some business transactions. So it's also important to understand those key differences and what they mean in terms of the customer journey and what they signal. So trying to measure these things as time to first call, time to first transaction, time to value is another one, which I think is sometimes very complicated. Things like I said, in terms of payments, you start making payments, but then as a business, if you're just making one payment at some point and you drop off, that's not really, you didn't bring value. But it's when a business starts to use your APIs on a regular basis and their business is starting to rely on your APIs, that's when they have hit a moment of value. It's like, yes, they are getting value out of your APIs. So that scale could vary for different APIs, but you have to study your customer base to identify these milestones in your customer journey and set what it means to reach time to value, and then measure these things across your customer base so that you can methodically improve your customer experience and iterate on your product over time. I think the final pillar for metrics, if your APIs are working well, your infrastructure is solid, you have your experience really well, then business metrics should be a consequence of it, which is your monthly recurring revenue. If people are getting value and are relying on your APIs, they are making transactions, then that should show in your business results. You should also be able to see that in terms of retention. So monitoring cohort retention, monitoring churn rate are very important in these areas, because that way you can really measure, in a lot of ways also validate your hypotheses of like, I think my experience is doing great, but then is it translating into business results? And then if it isn't, then what's the gap? So if you do these three things, and these could be partnering with multiple teams. Of course, the product manager is not the only owner, and you have to identify stakeholders and work with everyone who owns those metrics. But I think product managers are the one who bring them together, and in APIs, it can be really instrumental.
And do you have any tips on reporting of those metrics and maybe needs for different audiences and sort of presentation styles? What in your experience are some like high impact ways to share insights and findings from those metrics?
So it really depends on the tooling and infrastructure in different companies. I've seen having Looker dashboards for various things as the medium of being able to monitor and share the metrics that are being tracked. I think a lot of times having a recurring or like a schedule of like tracking monthly gain or quarterly milestones is very important, and that could be something that you share across with all your stakeholders. That could be sometimes in an email format, or it could be slides depending on your organization. But I think ultimately the metrics you track them regularly and track their trends is what is important.
I was just going to say, in terms of just tooling, there are a few tools out there when it comes to just reporting of some of those metrics. And again, different audiences might look for different things. So, something like maybe a HubSpot dashboard, for instance, might be great for marketing, maybe great for sales. And I think the kind of deals that are being generated, for instance, the revenue side of things, some of that might come in from there. If you're doing a little bit more, going into more details of things, I think there are other tools available as well, which you might be looking at. So for instance, if you're looking at how the community that Tyke is essentially performing, there's specific reporting around that. There's a really powerful data explorer, which tells you about how the trends are moving up or down, hopefully not. And, you can adjust accordingly. So I think a lot of tools and platforms today, they do prioritize a lot of these analytics and information because they understand the value that they bring to the table, because ultimately those analytics will be the key drivers behind making better decisions for people's products. It is going to actually address some of the pain points, the first few reasons why perhaps they even came into the first place. So I think that's probably an interesting one over there. There are three things that we've discussed so far: infrastructure, product, and business. Again, being mindful of time a little bit. It leads us quite nicely into probably the next segment, which is around the KPIs that you need to think about when you're thinking about a product strategy. So obviously we've spoken about infrastructure, product and business side of things. And we are going to be sharing the recording of this. We are going to be sharing, so Kavita, to your question, we are going to be sharing the recording of this afterwards. But equally, not just that, we do have a checklist about API analytics to your other question, which we will share to after this event as well in an email, which you will get. So that essentially details these different segments with specific checkpoints that you should be looking and thinking about when you are building things up. But to the question to you, Deepa, in terms of just the KPIs that you need to consider when you're building sort of a product strategy, how do you go ahead and actually think about KPIs, but also use them to build out a product strategy?
Absolutely. So when we think about metric, it's just like it's a measurement. But when we talk about KPIs, it's really it's key performance indicator, which is more custom to your specific product and your specific is moment in time for your product. So in terms of setting APIs, first you have to study what your current customers, how these particular metrics are performing for them. What is your average? So for example, if it's time to integration, time to first call, what is your current time to first call? Is it 10 minutes? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 3 weeks or 3 months? It could really vary depending on the size and scale of your customers. If it's a very large organization, sometimes it could even be a year. If your customers are enterprise customers, sometimes it takes a very long time for them to actually come online. So it can really vary depending on your target customer. So in terms of KPIs, I think it's important to first just baseline your KPIs in terms of where you are. And based on that, you can well, the second thing you can do is actually talk to customers and understand what they expect. Because if it took 6 months and that was not necessarily desirable, and just because everybody or most people are doing 6 months doesn't mean that that's what you should aim for. So talking to customers is also key in terms of identifying what your goals should be, and trying to find the right idea, right next target is very important. And the other thing is, one of the big challenges of APIs is benchmarking is really hard. So for some API products, you have comparable products out there. A lot of times you may not. So it's and it's also not always easy to actually go through a development cycle just to test out how long it takes, or how easy or difficult how effective their experience is overall. So it's very difficult to benchmark against competitors. There are some techniques that you can use, and I'm sure, Richard, you can probably jump in there. But I think the most effective that I've found is talking to your customers and identifying some of these KPIs that I mentioned. It's like time to first call is the most key metric that everybody should track. Uptime is another one from an infrastructure perspective that I think everybody should definitely be looking at. So I think starting with a handful of metrics and then growing from there is also very important, because from day one you're not going to have all of the metrics on a dashboard. Yep. So that just never happens.
So I think just jumping in right there, I think it's very interesting because you say that I think knowing your customer is very, very essential, because a lot of times when we think about any kind of product today, we try to think about, okay, what is the fastest way to get up and running? What is the simplest workflows that are possible? And a lot of times that we put a lot of emphasis on it because we are sort of imposing how we would want the product to be. And a lot of times customers, and an example of a space where this might be true is security, for instance, where security, obviously you do want to simplify the way you do security, or, having identity as a service. You want to make it as simple as possible so that it's not overcomplicated. But at the same time, in a space of security, the ultimate, I would say not KPI, but the ultimate thing that will measure against your success is going to be whether there have been security incidences, or, whether how secure your APIs are. And that metric might not correlate necessarily to how fast you can set that all up, but how correctly you have set things up, or how correctly and robustly you've got things set up so that you don't have a security incident. So again, knowing your customer, what they would need instead of what you are imposing on them, is a very key distinction there. I'm pretty certain, Rich, this is entirely your wheelhouse, understanding and talking to customers. So tell us some of the, your insights on this.
Well, I think to Deepa's point, like once you've identified what you're going to measure, and then you've figured out that you want to put essentially a KPI is just a target, right? It's saying, well, we've got this maybe like performance measure, and we deem that the average performance level should be X per month or something like that. I think that's the nature of a KPI, is one that you measure regularly against and track your performance. So, and I think, as we were saying, the key is to understanding a customer. So I think my approach would be, if you're going to set up a beta, when you first launch a product, part of that should be to understand, well, if we take a small sample, relatively small sample size, and I think the key there is to not just coldly look at the numbers, but then to also look at this, like the customer segments, the user segments. So have some way of analyzing within the data that you get back from your beta customers to say, well, okay, maybe we see that a handful of customers hit the benchmark and a handful of customers didn't. And follow up to then say, well, okay, well, the customers who are maybe more technically savvy and get the products and the apps that they develop on top of it, if that all is up and running correctly, we see this type of behavior. And then you might say, well, okay, we set a KPI at that level. And then I think the key thing about KPIs is that they're often, like you say, tracking performance. But from my perspective as a researcher, I'm always interested in the behavioral metrics that you might get out alongside that. So you might see that, okay, frequent users demonstrate a different behavior to infrequent users, and that then has some impact on the KPI. So then you might look at your KPI and say, well, we can't really average out performance on a monthly basis on our whole customer base. And you might say it's a little bit more nuanced than that. You might say, well, actually, we're more interested in key performance of, let's say, our highest using customers. and then gather insights that way to then deem, well, what does good look like for them, and how can we then measure more specifically for that audience. So I think it's a lot about getting customers on early, looking not just at what they're like, how they're hitting KPIs, but understanding what is it within their behavior that means that they're more or less likely to hit those KPIs, and then being able to segment so that you can track specifically the different cohorts.
I also want to share some specific KPIs that are generally tracked across organizations. So, for example, for infrastructure, uptime is key. Like you'll often see like 99.9% uptime, and it's like advertised in a lot of company documents, and it's also something that drives agreements between contracts between companies. So, for example, if a business is dependent on your APIs and your APIs go down, then what does that mean for that business and the loss of business that they experience? So a lot of times when you start thinking about APIs at scale, those are some of the things at play. And infrastructure, which is like purely engineering, any kind of outage, any kind of issue can lead to your uptime going down, which could essentially have a lot of business impact. So you'll see a lot of developers your engineers being on call and making sure that your infrastructure is up and running, and that doesn't happen. So tracking that uptime, availability of your APIs, I think a great way to kind of, as a PM, to kind of learn about how that is presented is if you go to status pages, API status pages of any of the APIs. Twilio has a status page. Stripe also has a status page, which you can look at in terms of how that metric is presented to customers. It is publicly available because they put it out there, so in case it's down, people can know. And from product perspective, time to first transaction or time to value tends to be the most key metric that is tracked, the KPI that is tracked, and trying to reduce that. And if you have a baseline of, for example, a week, or you're trying to build something, let's say a no-code experience, you set a goal of like somebody should be able to click through and complete this integration in 5 minutes. So in both in case of PayPal and Stripe, they have these, you can select what your payment page should look like, and then it generates code that you can copy paste. And that's the idea, is you can get to transactions really quickly, and you can get to integration really quickly. So time to business transaction, time to value is what is the key product metric that is most widely tracked. In terms of some of the other things that business, of course, the monthly recurring revenue and everything is important, but there's also these aspects of like support metrics, how many people are actually running into issues while integrating. And if that is a very high percentage, then that is a problem that needs addressing. There's also something that Budha brought up earlier is security, and that's really incidents per month that is tracked in terms of like how often you have incidences. There's also cost associated with it, and being able to track how much that monthly cost was, or how much average is per incident, is another very important metric that is widely tracked across many organizations.
I think there's a case to be made there in terms of how all three of those sort of segments are sort of correlated to each other, almost tied to each other there. Because when we think about uptimes and SLAs, they're not necessarily just in isolation. Like you said, it's about the reliability. It speaks to the reliability of the system, which again ties to your monthly recurring revenues and more deals, because they believe and trust the system that it's not going to go down at any point of time based off of those infrastructure metrics that we spoke about. Similarly with security as well, how secure is your system is going to be reflected on a couple of things, both at the infrastructure level as well as the product level. Therefore, to give that confidence at the business level to say, hey, yeah, we are reporting today that there are X number of incidents lesser than what it was before, because our infrastructure is a lot more reliable, it's a lot more stable, because our product is a lot easy to use now. So there is definitely sort of that correlated aspect here, which connects all three of them in a way. So when you're thinking about that product strategy, perhaps probably have to think about it from that holistic level, almost, where you think about, okay, my big priorities or the big challenges that I'm looking to track here, or what matters to me is this. And then based off of this, what will success look like? And we can go down each of these levels to look into it.
Absolutely. I think there's also this aspect of, well, UX is always very tied in to product. And I think overall, when you think about infrastructure, it's usually people who have already integrated with your APIs or already using them. So they are a little further along in their journey. They're active users. When you think about experience, a lot of times it's people who are early in their integration. They haven't reached integration success yet. So they are potential customers or customers in the journey. It's early journey. And in that you can measure things like support tickets and things like that. And I think ultimately later stage is where some of the business metrics like churn and retention rate is later in the customer journey. It are the things that you're measuring. So there's also this layer of where your customers are in their journey and what are the metrics that really map to it. So when you come across those metrics, like churn is up, then you know that it's the people who are in the later stage who have already been customers. So also associating each metric with where the customer is in their customer journey is really key. Being able to translate them, being able to identify them, prioritize them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a question for a little while now. So Ashwin, we haven't forgotten you. So thank you for that question. We're almost at time. So I'm going to prioritize this one before we sort of end the session. So Ashwin asks, of course, how do you level up your skills to be a successful API product manager? It seems like most of the content out there seems to be targeted either to developers or some other aspect. It's very difficult to understand how technical you need to be to become a successful API product manager. So yeah, very, very pertinent question over here. So go ahead.
Absolutely. I think when I first became an API product manager, and I really felt this problem of like, there is no real content or guidance out there in terms of like, how do you do this job? And it's definitely because of the nature of the product being technical, there is some organizations would expect a technical product manager. Some would sometimes be okay with like slightly less technical. So there is a little bit of nuance in terms of organizational culture. But I think in terms of if you're just starting out, and I think Postman is a great tool for people to learn about APIs without having to write code. So just experience the product. And there's a lot of content that we put out there, which is targeted towards people who don't code. And we also build a lot of tools to that effect. Of course, Postman collections, you can just fork a collection, start making some API calls and get started there. I think I found that to be the easiest way to start to learn about APIs before you start to code, of course. And coding often tends to be, should be optional for API product managers. And the other thing is, a lot of times you're building enterprise APIs anyway, so you don't actually have a way of building an application of that scale and test it anyway. So you have to rely on your technical counterparts, your stakeholders to do that. So in building certain APIs, you might have an opportunity to test them out and build it out, but in most cases, you actually don't. So most of the time, it is not an expectation to code in your API product management role, but it is important to understand some of the technicalities and things like the metrics that I mentioned for infrastructure, because those are the things that are being tracked, and those are the questions that you would be asking to your technical team.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think that's where I think there's a distinction between having to code something and build it yourself. But even that building, the notion of being technical is a little bit different today. I think originally being technical automatically meant being a developer or being part of the DevOps team, but I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. If you're technical, typically the expectation, I think, for you to become a successful PM is at least to understand the landscape a little bit more, understand what some of say the terminologies are, some of the key challenges are, and then being able to ask the right questions that will lead to hopefully the technical solution. So the technical solution, the more implementation details of it, I think if you can understand at least at a higher level, I think that is a really great starting point. Probably not to the point of the specifics of the programming language may not be necessary, but I think understanding the landscape, understanding the ecosystem enough to be asking the right question and correlating that to specifically, or connecting that specifically to the problems and the challenges that you see that the customers and the users are likely to face. That is the role here, so that we are looking at. But you're absolutely right. Resource-wise, it's a little bit of a limited landscape at this point. Thankfully, Deepa has written a book. We've managed to write an ebook of our own. So again, we'll be sharing resources all across. We've got a newsletter as well that we have started that is specifically focused on API product managers. It's in its infancy, but it's early days. But again, the idea was that we wanted to help out not just product managers within Tyke or Postman, but throughout the industry, because there is a bit of a dearth of not just, I wouldn't say experience, but dearth of information for those who are looking to level up today.
I do want to share an example for people to understand what kind of technical knowledge you could require. So if you are trying to understand your customers, for example, with your API users, you might have questions like, what programming languages do they use? What does their tech stack look like? So when you learn that, you have to be able to understand what some of the challenges or nuances could be of that particular tech stack. So things like that, which are very high level, are some things that would really help to learn in terms of being able to just learn more about your customers. So what kind of tools they use, being able to understand the tool's strengths and weaknesses, or how people are making these decisions of which programming language to use or what tech stack, how they make these decisions are really key. And if you want to understand those decisions, you have to be slightly technical, but it's really understanding it at an architecture level, or really that's one of the fun things about API product management, in my opinion, and something I really enjoy, is just how much I get to learn every day in terms of these things, is all these new tools and things that come up that people use and feel very passionately about, that we get to learn about and see how they're being used.
100%. I think we are at time already, so we're going to be doing finishing statements here almost. So I wanted to end this session with pretty much the key sort of not the key takeaways necessarily, but sort of I think top 3 best practices that you can sort of highlight. And I think we can all agree that one of those best practices definitely is going to be knowing your customer. I think 100%, I think we've spoken a lot about this already. So knowing your customer, absolutely top of mind. Understand what their pain points are, understand what they really need beyond the requirement and specification that's put on a document. And I think if you want to go a little bit further, just understanding what are the things that they are using, what does the tool set look like, what does their current technology stack look like, is going to be equally important. And perhaps you lean on your teammates as well as a product manager. Simply because you are sort of considered the leader of the team doesn't automatically mean that you have all the answers. In most cases, most leaders don't have all the answers. They lean on the team members, the technical parts of your team members, the tech leads, the consulting engineers, the customer engineers. They all come together. You're essentially a team. That is why you are a team. So know your customer in whichever way possible is probably the number 1 best practice that I would say, number 1 key takeaway here. But anything further, maybe the number 2 and number 3 that we might want to cover here before we close the session?
I think the second most important takeaway is measuring what matters in terms of, not just in terms of business results, but also in terms of the customer journey.
Awesome. Nice, short and simple. I think we've covered that in detail in the entire session. Richard, for number 3, so the final key points, once we have those metrics in place and we know our customer a little bit better, what would you say the final step is?
Well, I think it links to the discussion point around KPIs. And I think KPIs are ultimately what will gauge the success of your API, right? So I think it is crucial to design those based on an understanding of your user base and be able to not just see a number and say it's positive or negative, but to be able to understand what caused you're meeting that KPI or not. So I think KPI design is crucial, and not get too distracted by maybe some other more vanity metrics that are out there, but understand for your organization, for your business, what's going to matter to you.
Great. I think 3 key points, I think, across the team board. So know your customer for sure, understand, identify the metrics that would matter. And I think, again, like Richard mentions, try and distill away the ones that truly matter versus some that might be distractions. And then finally, I would say, measure every step of that journey. I think that is quite important. So not just setting those KPIs, but having those measured over a period of time within specific frequencies, and then ideally reporting them as well. Share those metrics with the wider team and see what responses are getting. Are you on the right track or not? Is your product on the right track or not? I think all of that needs to be a feedback loop of sorts, both internally and externally, for you to really understand the impact of the APIs and the API products that you've got. So definitely know your customer, identify the metrics, and then measure all the way. And then obviously iterate as things progress. So with that, I think it's been a fantastic session. Thank you, everyone, for the questions that you've posed. Obviously, there's going to be the recording of this video that is going to be available early next week, along with some of the nice little resources, including the checklist that I mentioned previously from Deepa, who's kindly agreed to share it. Her book is available today on Amazon at this point of time. So by all means, go ahead and get a copy for yourself. We are going to do a book giveaway at the end of as a, sort of a follow-up for this session. So stay tuned. All the details are going to be in the email that comes up as a follow-up. But once again, thank you so much for being part of today's discussion. It's been really, really valuable. Thank you so much, Deepa. Thank you so much, Richard, as well. It's been fantastic and really insightful into the world of metrics that matter. All right, then. Cheers. Until next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Budha.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.